This episode of the BeanCast is brought to you by Content Marketing World, the world's premier content marketing event. Find out more at contentmarketingworld.com today. Use the offer code BeanCast. Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Visit them on the web at recursivesquirrel.com. Episode 552, Private Privacy. Monday, July 22nd, 2019. It's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob North. Thanks for joining us. The news on some of the most recognizable brands is dire. Many of them are losing billions in brand valuation as they face more nimble competitors and shrinking consumer loyalty. So what are the smartest brands doing to fight back? Tonight we'll discuss. Also, how big tech privacy initiatives may be worsening the problem, why we need more expensive advertising, reaching peak podcasting, plus the good, the bad, and the ugly. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with a longtime contributor to the AdPulp blog and the author of two of his own books, freelance copywriter Mr. Dan Goldgeier. Dan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back, Bob. It's always a pleasure.
It's my pleasure. Now, next up, we're pleased to welcome back to the program the Chief Marketing and Innovation Officer at California agency RPA, Mr. Tim Leake. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Bob. I'm pleased to be back. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And finally, he's been leading digital transformation at Campbell's Soup, but will soon be moving on to a new opportunity, very secretive right now. Mr. Sam Monnie joins us. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Bob. Thanks for having me back so soon. I am super excited and trying to stay cool in this 101-degree weather in Philadelphia right now.
I know. We're having the same weather here in New York, and it's terrible. I haven't even walked out of my door. It was hard enough doing it yesterday. Well, let's jump right into the topics. First up, there's little doubt that some of the largest and most storied brands out there are in a time of crisis. I mean, some of the headlines that have been out recently, Kraft Heinz announced that their Oscar Mayer and Kraft brands are now worth $15 billion less than they thought they were. Coty bought Clairol and CoverGirl only to watch those brands lose almost $4 billion in value since the purchase. I mean, the picture can be really bleak when you start digging into these valuation stories. But instead of focusing on the negatives, Sam, let's talk about positives. How are brands like these fighting back, and what is making a difference right now? You have a lot of experience in this area. What would you say?
Well, thank you for boosting me and boosting my ego there, Bob. And yes, listeners, I am around to explain to you how to save the world and how I can put it all to rights.
No, I didn't give you that much credit there, sir.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll take some of that. So first of all, full disclosure, I've been affiliated with, some of the companies in the source material that you actually referenced here. So I'm going to avoid being specific to any experiences or knowledge or anything proprietary, and instead talk from the heart and the years of experience as a marketer across the industry segments and cultures. And I'm going to actually start off by saying I refute the article. There is a lot of hope for the scale brands. And because the article says that the source material talked about, well, all you can do is defend your position and change the packaging. And any good marketer knows that's not true.
Oh, absolutely. That was one of my first thoughts when I saw this article. It was so negative and it was damning.
It was a bootleg article because they could have done some more due diligence in my mind. And there are chinks in the armor of the DTC players. Yes, they're nimble, but many are finding huge churn issues and limited consumer loyalty. And so I can make this argument in two ways, Bob. There's the little capabilities argument, the little C argument, and the big C the big capabilities argument, but you're probably going to cut me off before I get them through both. But I shall begin.
That's my job.
So the case for the defense is that legacy brands and the incumbents are actually winning, but you need to know what it takes to build an irresistible brand, Bob. I mean, so when you think about capabilities, little capabilities, I'm thinking having true strong insights, having brands with purpose, and being culturally relevant and current. And so those three things can help you win. And I'll just say, okay, which brands are staying relevant and current? You've got Domino's for a while there. They've been winning by reducing the friction of wanting pizza and being everywhere. And you can get there through an emoji, or they're getting rid of potholes or giving you insurance if you dropped your pizza. Domino's were winning. Look at what Axe have done. For the last few years, they've changed their positioning. 10 years ago, they stood for spray more, get more, the Axe effect. And in the Me Too era, that would have been a disaster. But in the last 3 or 4 years, they've shifted to sort of find your magic and changing the definition of masculinity, and they're still relevant. Brands with purpose. I could talk about Ben & Jerry's, who are campaigning for everything under the sun, including marriage equality. And the founders talking about, white privilege got them there, got them the funding to start off the business. The Dove campaign for real beauty. Those are two brands with purpose, which just happen to be Unilever brands, but they're still winning. And then brands which have unlocked deep consumer insights. You can think of the work that Snickers have done. And there's been, a lot of case studies about how that's actually driven and grown their business. There's some great work from Pedigree and how they focused on the emotional benefit of building affinity with dog ownership instead of just trying to sell food. So from the little C in terms of purpose, in terms of insights, and in terms of cultural relevance, there's a bunch of brands, scale brands, large brands winning. So I refute that. If you're a good marketer, those are like 6 or 7 examples of brands that are winning. So I will rest my first argument and let you. I was expecting an interruption there, but Heinz Mayo Chup. That was a wonderful experience last year from the brand, because they made you get agitated between ketchup and mayonnaise. How dare you put those two things together? Bunch of impressions, bunch of insight, bunch of awareness and appreciation that helped launch a new product from a legacy brand. That's another one.
But yet a lot of these brands that you mentioned still have their share of problems. It's not that they're not doing innovative things and sales are going well for these brands, but the valuation of the brands has been affected negatively over this time period. You can blame DTC. I'm with you on that, Sam. I think that DTC brands have their own share of problems, and we can't credit them as being the sole disruptor here. So why are they losing value? I mean, Tim, do you want to jump in and give your thoughts on this?
Sure. I think in many ways brands matter, or brands work when they matter to people. At the end of the day, I've never really believed, as much as a lot of people in this industry seem to believe, that people love brands, outside of maybe a handful of exceptions. But brands are useful in that they help us make decisions. And as advertisers, we can provide value by building up brands that people are attracted to when they need to make a buying decision in the store. It's really almost as simple as that. And the fact of the matter is, a brand like Oscar Mayer, that's valuable when I'm trying to decide what kind of hot dogs I want to buy, but they're never going to get me to buy hot dogs if I'm not interested in eating hot dogs. And I think in many cases what's happening is a bigger issue away from the sorts of products that a lot of these brands are associated with. It could very well be the reason that some of these brands are losing value, as you say. And I don't know quite how they're putting up a number effect on what the brand is worth anyway. But at the end of the day, unscientifically, it seems like people are a lot less interested in eating hot dogs these days than they were when I was a kid. That just seems to be the case. So I think, when a brand matters, and that's a very broad word, but I like it for that reason, because there's lots of ways that a brand can matter, not just one. And D2C companies matter for certain reasons, and other brands matter for certain reasons. When a brand matters to people, that still has value. It doesn't mean we love it. It doesn't mean we're passionate about it. It doesn't mean we're brand advocates that are going to go, tell all my friends about your brand because you did an activation at the mall. It means I like it better than everything else that I have an option of buying right now, and I choose to buy that.
Go ahead, Dan.
Oh, I was going to say, I agree with a lot of what Tim said. And in the case of Oscar Mayer, they don't just make hot dogs; they make a lot of luncheon meats, and they can only ride the nostalgia of the Wienermobile for so long. They have to be aware of changing tastes in America, the changing palates, the different ways that we um, get food delivered to us now, and how much fresh food there is in supermarkets. There's no law that says a brand has to live forever, but they have to be aware of what's going on and kind of where the future is headed.
Something I'm considering here is this valuation question, whether or not this valuation question is not really looking deep enough into the brands and what they're doing. Because what you've been talking about, what you've both been talking about, have been these legacy products that continue to be a weight on the organization that they're trying to protect and preserve because they have a lot of brand equity and they represent a lot of the profit of the company. But at the same time, these products don't reflect today's consumer. And so they're trying to build up new brands in response to that, but they're still being weighed down by old brands. I mean, is that, Sam, let me ask you.
That's why I gave you the examples I did. Axe is an old brand. Spray more, get more.
Right.
The Axe effect. You spray Axe, and women throw themselves at you. That would not work in 2019.
Okay, but that's not the same thing. You're always going to need deodorant. It's just like deodorant is still a product. Deodorant is still a product that people want, and it's just like we're not talking about hot dogs here, where people are not eating hot dogs as much, or Coca-Cola, where people are not drinking sugar water as much anymore. I mean, it's just like being relevant to the consumer with your brand is still important. But, at the same time, it's easy for a brand that represents a product that people actually still use to do something like that. It's harder for a product that maybe represents something that is against current consumer trends.
Well, it all depends on perception, right? Because I think for a lot of the brands, what do people think and see? What is Snickers is sugar bar then in that case, right? So I think Ben & Jerry's, what is that? Ice cream? I mean, that's one of the least healthy products. It's cream and sugar, but no one's protesting or boycotting Ben & Jerry's as far as I checked last time. And so we as human beings we're kind of complex creatures, and we allow certain things and we tolerate certain things, but we also give certain things permissions and reasons to buy into them. So I think there's a lot more going on than the physical product and its physical properties, and there's a lot going on besides the kind of in the gray matter and how we judge and perceive and receive things. So for me, the point I wanted to make here is that you can influence people, you can influence consumers and give them more of what they want, as long as you have the right sort of stories and insight behind it. But also when it comes to actually fixing some of the challenges in business, for me, it's how you're organized and the ways of working. And one of the biggest challenges I see for a lot of brands is who's closest to the data to make decisions, to influence what actually makes it to the market and makes it into consumers' hands, because there's lots of knowledge, especially with the more diverse cultures that we have across countries. There's more opportunities for different flavors, to different, I'm always fascinated whenever you go to Japan and you see the 100 different varieties of Kit Kat and the different flavors out there, and why those flavor profiles aren't in the US in comparison to what's in other cultures and markets. I've lived in England, I've lived in Germany, and I've seen a lot of these trends coming, especially this organic and this more healthy movement. 10 years ago when I was living in Germany, you were seeing all these trends and thinking the consumer in the US isn't any different. It's just that they haven't been made available to them. And as these things come across, then consumers are just choosing. They've always wanted it, but they just never had access. So I think the legacy brands need to give the solutions to the consumers and really understand what's motivating them. And I think a lot of them can. I gave you some examples and I can give you, I think, more. But I think the dynamic, especially in the food industry, of these discounter retailers coming from overseas, it's heaven for me, because it's forcing the marketplace here to really give consumers the opportunity to try different things. I'm a huge fan of Indian food coming from the UK. That's just a huge staple. And now I'm seeing in the last few years more and more choices available to me of these different flavor profiles that the consumers will still like and love. So I don't know if there is just a general rejection of the brands and more about how those brands can be better at connecting with their consumers.
No, maybe you can clarify.
Allowing people who are close to the data to really push those solutions to meet those consumer needs.
Maybe you can clear this up for me, Sam, because I'm listening to you and what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Consumers do want more choice. but I don't have enough of the data to understand why it works and how it works in Japan or in Europe or other places around the world and doesn't work in the United States. And, the only thing I can posit is that from a standpoint of how much a Kit Kat bar costs in Japan, they're willing to pay more for it, so they've got the opportunity for more choice. It comes down to an economic problem. It costs a lot to do specialty products because you can't do enough of them at scale to make money.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there's a number of barriers that are preventing organizations. I'll take a bit of a pivot, and I'll use the example of there's a huge passion and focus on the K-pop bands, BTS, and these groups, which are huge, right, in the US. No one understands a single word of what they're singing about. Because
You're right about that.
The audience of teen, no, but the audience.
The
of
chorus
teens,
is usually in English.
but the audience of teens, it's about how the music makes you feel, and and how you engage with it and how you dance to it. It's not actually about the words that are said in those songs. So if you understand that insight, the reason there's a huge market to drive these pop bands is go to other cultures and bring that music to the US, and you're going to be huge. Not because you're the same five white guys dancing the same routine, because it's just the music and the energy makes you feel something. So the insight and the consumer understanding created a huge market and a growth opportunity for the music industry. So there's always, and the audience hasn't changed. It's still American teens, right? You're talking to. So I still think it's about what I talked earlier about the insight and a true understanding of what is really motivating people, and not being deluded by what you've done in the past, and actually changing for today. I've used the music, I've used deodorant brands, and you kind of push back on that. So I'm still typing furiously on my keyboard trying to find other examples, Bob. But I believe it's possible, which is why I talk about
Sam,
insight and consumer understanding. What do they really care about? It's not the words, it's actually how the music makes you feel. That means K-pop, South Korean K-pop will work in America. That sounds crazy, but it's true.
But I like what you said there at the end. What do they really care about? But you did say something earlier, which is you said that people in the U.S. are just the same as they are in the U.K. or they are in Germany, and I don't think that part is true. I mean, there's a reason, in Japan, one of the most popular flavors of Kit Kat bar is green tea. That's never going to be a mainstream thing here in the United States because that's not part of our culture. It's not a taste profile that Americans are ever going to particularly like. It'll never be anything more than niche, and you can't buy it. You just have to go to Mitsuwa, the Japanese grocery store, in order to buy it here in the United States. So it really is just about understanding what it is that people will like, and sometimes you can borrow those from someplace else, and sometimes you can't. But I think it's dangerous to assume that just because it worked someplace else, it'll work in any other country.
And I would push back and say, it's dangerous to say because it works somewhere else, it won't work here. I just think the concept of raw fish is abhorrent culturally when I grew up, especially in England. That's called sushi. I love sushi. So I think we can all, cultures change over time, especially if you look at, especially in the US. Again, I talked about Indian food, dulce de leche. There's lots of profiles. Even McDonald's last week, they had the whole campaign, I think, the last few weeks. Get these international flavors over here for a week and all these funky burger things, but they're still bringing them to this market as niche items for 3 weeks. Next year, it will be 6 weeks. Then there'll be permanent items. So, I remember being, Australia for years had the flat white, and that was launched 3 years ago in America. We're introducing the flat white, and the Aussies are going, we've had this for like ever. What's going on? Flat white is a common coffee product in the US now. So I think the adoption curve is shrinking, and also the access to the world is becoming more apparent. And I know we've kind of digressed here, but I just think there's lots of opportunities to win with consumers, and especially these legacy bigger brands. They've actually connected to the whole globe. Often they're international and global brands, and I think that's the biggest trick that some of them can tap into. Bring those global ideas into the US and other markets, and you can win, because if you're winning with consumers in France or the consumers in Asia or South America, those taste profiles, those passion points, those needs can be met in with your product in this market. You just got to have the bravery. Yes, you got to do your research, but also you got to have the guts to believe you can influence people's behaviors, influence people's taste profiles, get them to drink cold coffee instead of hot coffee, get them to drink espresso. You can change people's behaviors, because guess what? That's what's happening. Bubble tea. You can get people to try new things, and guess what? If they like them, you can grow. So I think there's huge opportunity.
So let me loop this back to the original topic, because I think one of the things you point out there is actually we have a bit of a or I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. We've almost got a bias towards novelty right now. Like new stuff is really interesting. And I actually didn't get to say it earlier, but one of the reasons that I think legacy brands are having a hard time holding on is that same phenomenon. A lot of times, I don't know why, I've not researched this, but it just seems like people like newer stuff better than they like legacy stuff. And sometimes there might be this nostalgia aspect to it. But the case in point I use, like one of the most, the case study we out constantly in this industry is Kodak, and saying, okay, well, if Kodak actually created the digital camera, and if only they developed Instagram, they would have had Instagram instead of somebody else doing it. But can you imagine if Kodak had actually built Instagram? I think people would have rejected it because it's like a grandfather building something. It wasn't cool. It was cool because of who did build it, because it was Instagram, because Kodak didn't build it. And that's an interesting aspect of this
you also have to consider how much of this is cyclical. How much of this goes on over and over again. It's we get all bent out of shape because brand valuations are going south, or where big brands are having trouble in the marketplace being relevant to consumers. But I got to imagine that most of these brands had the same problems during the 60s. I have to imagine that most of these brands continued to have problems like this through the 90s. I mean, it's one of those things where, we go through this change in the culture at large, where one generation takes place and supplants the previous generation, and we have upheaval until suddenly everybody's got a minivan again and everybody's driving a Ford. It's just the way it happens.
There's truth behind that, Bob, because the orange juice was created by the orange growers who needed to find a way to get to market, which wasn't dependent on oranges, and they created orange juice. The coffee break was the coffee growers finding a way to be more relevant to consumers, so they called this thing the coffee break. It was just a break that people are taking, and they branded it the coffee break. So again, if people actually studied their marketing history, they'll realize that halitosis was created because they couldn't quite get a mouthwash to gel with consumers. So they came up with this thing which sounded scary and scientific, called it halitosis, and all of a sudden, I need this mouthwash. So in history, in culture and our knowledge, people have found a way to solve a business challenge or meet a cultural need. And I think that's going on around us. So that's what gives me hope, because when I tell people the orange juice example or the coffee break, they look at me as if I'm crazy. And I just go and research it, and you find that it's true. But we've taken these for granted in the last sort of 10, 20 years as a norm. So what's going to be, it's like Amazon Prime. 3 years ago, if you'd have said, hey, we're going to come up with a promotional day in the middle of summer when everyone's on vacation, and it's going to be a phenomenon that everyone copies, people would just say, come on, get the hell out of here. Now Prime Day is a thing. It's now 2 days, right? And so I think we can all create these moments of these events to turn around the trajectory of our business. But you've got to have the vision, you've got to have the insight and the belief. And hopefully those examples can show you that those are seismic shifts in those industries by creating a way to be relevant and current and connect with consumers and generate demand for your proposition, as long as you're not doing something nasty or selling something evil or devious or drugs or something, which is pernicious.
Like halitosis?
Well, exactly. I mean, look, having fresh breath, that helps me and it helps you. So I think that's a win-win, right? So I think that's a good example.
I used to have a boss who used to offer me a mint, and it's just like I'd say no, and he'd say, "Are you sure? You don't know why I'm asking."
Whenever someone offers you a mint, you take two.
You take two.
You take two. That is the answer to it. Want a mint? I'll take 2, or even 3, perhaps.
All right.
It's interesting. I was going to say this weekend is the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, which reminded me, whatever the hell happened to Tang? We're not going to get a revival of that anymore.
My wife and I were just talking about that 2 weeks ago. I miss Tang.
Well, we're going to move. We're going to move on.
Tang are listening in; they might bring that back. Because
eventually, when the guests allow me to do this, we're going to move on.
Sorry, Bob, it's your show. Over to you.
We're going to move on, and we're going to talk next about privacy initiatives and how these privacy initiatives by the big tech companies may not be doing exactly what we think they're doing. They may actually be making the problem a little worse. We'll get to that in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about our sponsor, Content Marketing World. Look, Content Marketing World is the world's original and largest annual gathering of content marketing professionals, all coming to Cleveland, Ohio to hear about the latest subjects on content marketing. Every topic imaginable is covered, and they've got one of the most exceptional lineups I have ever seen for a conference. I mean, Henry Rollins and Mindy Kaling, they're both going to be headlining this event. They've got nearly every major brand and globally in attendance for this thing. They're expecting over 4,000 attendees. Now, when you get up into the 4,000s at a conference, that's something pretty extraordinary. That's where you start moving from some small conference into one of the bigger conferences that you have to attend. And when you have every major global brand in attendance at this thing, it's going to be a wealth of new business prospects, lots of opportunities for you to get face-to-face with the people who mean the most to your business. And, we've got so many people who are going to be speaking at this event who have been BeanCast alumni. I know I've talked a lot about that over the last few weeks as I've started running these ads on the program, but it really is amazing to me how many people have shown up on their speaker list. I mean, Scott Stratton, Christopher Penn, so many people that I'm like completely blanking on right now. So many of the people who have been on the show over and over again, they're going to be in attendance at this year's event. So agency people, I want you in particular to pay attention to this because they are really out to get agency people to show up at this year's conference. Agency people, for some reason, have not known about it. I mean, all the brands know about it. The inside marketing operations, they know about it, but the agencies don't. And I want you to come check out their agency track of sessions or their branded content track. I want you to come drink free booze at the agency exclusive cocktail hour. They've got that too. And don't forget, with hundreds of new business prospects roaming the convention hall, this is a place you definitely want to be. There isn't any good excuse for you not to send at least one staff member to this event. And if you can make it yourself, I definitely recommend that you should go to this. September 3rd is when it starts, and it runs through the 6th of September. Cleveland, Ohio is the place. So don't wait. Register today at contentmarketingworld.com. Use the offer code BeanCast. That's BeanCast all caps. I don't know why, but you have to do it that way to get the offer. And they're going to knock $100 off your price when you do it that way. So make sure you go to contentmarketingworld.com, offer code BeanCast. Register today, and I'll be looking for you at this year's event. Well, moving on, Adweek ran an interesting opinion piece last week about the privacy initiatives being launched by big tech firms. On the surface, all this looks really great, Tim. I mean, when you start looking at it, you go and say these big companies are starting to really take privacy serious for the first time. Either that or they're being forced to do it by all the government regulations that are coming down on them. But what are the pitfalls? What are we not seeing? Why is it that the privacy initiatives that are going on right now could potentially be making the problems worse for consumers?
Well, it starts to feel like Groundhog Day around the privacy conversation. It's always like, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. We're not even moving either direction most of the time. But within this article, the thing that I thought was most interesting really was how he ended it, which is basically don't be creepy. And that's something that we talk about a lot, I'd say, in this industry. A lot of the privacy issues that are out there, they're going to be here. It's just part of the new normal. It just is. But it's the creepy stuff. That's where we're crossing the line. That's where people are going to start getting upset. That's where people are going to be up in arms over this. If otherwise, it's, I'm sure I'm not alone in the amount of privacy I give up on a regular basis that I don't realize that I'm giving up. But if it benefits me, I'm fine with it. And I imagine most of the world is too. I know a small, tiny bit of people who freak out and shut everything down, but then they're divorcing themselves from the rest of the world. In terms of, like the pitfalls that we're not seeing, I wish I had a clear-cut answer to this. It's really just a matter of, what they talk about in the opinion piece that you mentioned is that the pitfalls are really that we think this is getting better, but it's really only getting better for a select few. And for the most part, the big companies are still going to be doing this, and they own so much of the pie, so to speak, that not that much is changing. So I guess the only other thing that I would say the potential pitfall is once we get used to this crack, once brands are used to it, advertisers are used to it, the companies are used to it. If you tell us we can't have it over here, we're going to find ways to get it elsewhere. And that's what I mean about the 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. I feel like it's just this dance. We're just going to keep moving around and do it in a different way.
For me, when I was reading this article, the thing that stood out the most about this situation is that when you take away third-party data, which is really what we're talking about here, when we're talking about privacy, we're talking about the cookie. We're talking about things that are third-party tracking devices that bring about all these ads in weird places that we didn't expect to see them. I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the third-party data that is used to cleanse email lists and give us new email names so that we can do prospecting blasts, things like that. They're
But if
gonna
I understand it right, Google, Facebook, Amazon, those will all still work exactly the same.
exactly, and because of that, we're going to be relying entirely upon first-party data, which means the cost of that data is going to go up, and we're not necessarily going to have any more privacy. But just because the big players are in charge of our data now, we know from our Facebook experience that doesn't always give us complete safety when we're talking about our personal privacy. And as marketers, that's concerning to me. I mean, it makes me feel like this is not necessarily a good thing. I think it's a really salient point. I mean, Dan, what would you say about this situation?
You know, I just think there's never going to be a full transparency in terms of privacy and what tech firms are doing or are not doing to provide a sense of privacy. The reality is we just don't know what's being shared. We just don't know what's being collected, and we're never going to know. I mean, think about this week. Everybody was freaked out about this Russian-backed facial app, or the one that ages your face, and then people did it, and then they said, well, okay, the company that is behind this is sweeping up all sorts of data, and people just thought it was a fun thing to do, but we really don't know what they collected on us. We don't know where they're going to take that data or what they're going to do or who they're going to try to profile. And it goes back to what I think Tim said, which is what are you as a consumer willing to give up in order to take advantage of the technology of a modern life? And there's always going to be, for most of us, we're going to give up a lot.
You know, I was just listening in here, and I think there's a bunch of marketers right now who haven't got a clue what to do. They don't know what's going on. They've outsourced all this to their agencies, and they're crossing their fingers and keeping their eyes shut.
Oh, I thought you were talking about. I thought you were talking about us, a bunch of marketers that don't know what they were doing to do.
No, I
That
just think
too.
they're closing their eyes, putting fingers in their ears, and they're just like saying, "Agency, fix it. Oh, you're bad." Or I just think the complexity, the world you just described, and especially the most recent example where this thing came out, everyone did it, and it said, "Oops. Did I just give them permission to download or upload all of my images in perpetuity? If that's a word even in Russia. What's going to happen to it? Well, it sucks to be you because that you just did that." So I think there's a lot of bad behavior, but there's just a lot of unknown behavior, and it's like a lot of industries. If you peek behind the curtain, you probably wouldn't like what you saw, right? And I think that's the challenge, because we all know that if it's for free, you are their profit margin, and we've all known that, and we all should have known that for the last 10-15 years. I get very nervous when I'm typing on Gmail and it predicts what I'm going to say, and it is really accurate, and then I'm going to the airport to pick up my wife, and it knows that I need to go to the airport, and it's pulling all this information together. And did I actually say yes to that or no? So I think from a consumer perspective, from a consumer perspective, it's problematic. From a marketing perspective, and I think 85% of marketers don't know how to handle this and don't handle it well. And I know that some of the industry bodies are talking about this more and more, but there's going to be a come to your religious leader moment in the next, there's been a few issues, but there's going to be a major issue. And Facebook, I think we're fined for, $5 billion, and they still keep going. So there's going to be something probably more problematic that forces the industry to really put some guardrails in place for the brand, from the brand perspective, as much as from the advertiser or the
but we're not even talking about that, because that's a problem that all the brands are going to have to face. I agree with you wholeheartedly, but what we're talking about is who do we trust with our data? And I would be more willing to trust the Russian hackers who put together the Face app than I would to be trusting Google or Facebook to be the sole arbiter of what's going to happen to my data. I mean, it's just like
that's a bit steep.
But I mean, I know that's a ludicrous thing. But I mean, first of all, everybody, it's just like the tech security experts out there said that all the brouhaha about the Face app thing, that was all overblown. There was nothing that they were taking that was not already being taken by everybody else.
Yeah, by everybody else, exactly.
So it wasn't as bad as it made out to be. But having said that, I mean, when you have all your data, when you have most of the data control lying in the hands of a few big players, how much does that stifle the small player who wants to get in on some kind of new innovation or bring some new product to market? It makes it that much harder because you have to go through the door that's set up by Apple or Amazon. You can't go through the door that's set up by the free and open internet.
It kind of
stumped us.
Yeah, well, you haven't. Yes, and I just yes, and Bob. I'm a huge
spoken like
Spotify fan, right?
spoken like somebody who's from Chicago or was in Chicago for an awful long time.
I'm a huge Spotify fan, and apparently, if I favorite an album, I give rights to the record companies to upload stuff to my my account. And I didn't agree to that. I just love this artist. I can't wait for this song to come out. I didn't give you permission to do X. So I think there is. Yes, there's a problem, but I don't think it's to put it all on these three or four. Is flawed, because I think any organizations, then you're going to have to throw in the Spotifys of this world, or I'm just thinking the AT&Ts of this world. So everyone we partner with or we work with, or we as consumers rely on their services, the Netflixes of this world. And so now the list is not, I think, those big four. I think that you're going to probably get to 27 or 30 people in this. And so I think to point just to those few is obviously they're the big guys, but I think there's more to it than we think and know. And someone's going to pivot and say, look, we are going to be transparent. We are going to be honest. We're going to tell you what the ROI we get from your data, and we're going to change that value equation and push it back to more being consumer centric. And then, of course, certainly coming from Europe, the legislators over there are being a lot more rigorous and robust, and so those companies are operating differently in other markets, and they're going to have to change how they do it in the US and perhaps North America, because we as consumers can see how they're doing things differently in other countries. Why won't you treat us as well?
But again, Sam, it goes back to my original question. So the European Union is making those companies operate differently. They're trying to limit the amount of use of third-party data and give the control of consumer data back to the consumer. But what they're in effect doing is concentrating the data resources that are available to marketers among a very few big players. Yeah. Now that is a problem, and it's an unintended consequence that I think is really problematic. And if that's going to continue, it's going to be an issue that we're going to face for a long, long time.
What's funny is Sam, you talked about transparency and how important that is, and I think one of the biggest flaws is we don't have transparency when it comes to the terms and conditions we sign, what we're giving away. I always feel like a completely naive bumpkin when I talk about legal issues like terms and conditions, and yet I have never in my entire life understood why they are written in a format that regular people cannot understand and interpret. We sign away very quickly. We scroll to the bottom and say, yes, I accept this. Even if I spent time reading it, I wouldn't understand what I was agreeing to. And that's one of the bigger problems that we have to deal with. We are not being transparent with what we are giving up, with how we are explaining it. Nobody is ever. And when we can crack that, then we can actually make informed
But
decisions as
whose
people.
job is to whose job is it to fix it? Because you make a
Lawyers.
great point. Well, no, I think this is where the brands and the companies and those organizations could step forward and say, we will, in the UK it was called a campaign for plain English, and I think it's still around.
like-
But you're making the terms and conditions, you're putting them up front, and you're making them on a page that is in English that I can understand. Now, very few and far between people meet that standard. But who are the warriors to say we're going to make those terms and conditions easy, simple, and understandable? And it's why is it all in legalese that any reasonable person knows that you scroll as quickly as possible and click that I agree button, and then you click the next one, and you just you take your new phone home. I agree to all this stuff. I haven't read it. I sometimes ask them to email me the terms and conditions, but I don't read that email.
Right. Yeah. Well, you talk about customer centricity, and any brand out there, any company out there that considers themselves customer centric, that then doesn't do that with their terms and conditions and their legalese that they're providing for their customers, I'd want to ask why. Like, why are we not making? I mean, might just be because it's really hard, or the lawyers wouldn't let us, or who knows. It's why I say I'm being naive when I say this, but. Why you ask who's going to take the mantle up and do it? I would say any company that considers themselves customer centric ought to pick up that flag and try to run that forward.
That'd be nice.
Well, we're going to move on. I want to talk next.
My perfect world.
Yeah.
There's this other story that came up this week that I really loved. In agreement with a talk by Publicis' Rashad Tabakawala, who's been on this program before as well, Media Post ran an opinion piece that argued we have fallen victim to cheaper, faster, and plentiful in advertising, and what we really need to get back to is fewer, more thought out, and expensive approaches. Now, Dan, in theory, this sounds great. I mean, who wouldn't want more time to do ads, think through the ads a little bit more, and get more money for doing those ads? But are any of these sentiments really actionable today? I mean, how much hope do you have that this might actually become a reality?
Yeah, not much hope. I mean, Rashad, he's the chief growth officer of Publicis. Where does he think his company's investments are being made right now? They're being made in artificial intelligence, not human intelligence. Look, all the money and the effort right now is being spent, like we've talked about, automating the process, whether it's programmatic or retargeting or some other data-driven approach that creates individual level consumer profiles. And that's only going to increase. All of that requires machines to figure out who I am as a consumer and what I want, and to hammer that to me everywhere I go or where they think I go.
But going back to the first story, though, I mean, about brand value and the shrinking brand valuation that's going on, isn't this part of the reason that that's happening? Because the big players are automating and they're getting faster and they're getting cheaper, and people are going, I've had enough of you.
Yeah, and the only way you're going to get fewer or more thought out or expensive approaches is if you radically up your marketing budgets to do one of a couple of things. One, truly direct marketing that's sort of almost a human-to-human direct sales approach where everybody almost has a personal shopper at any brand that you do business with, or the complete opposite, which is a big budget brand campaign that's plastered all over TV and streaming video and everywhere you go. I don't think we're going back to fewer and more thought out and expensive approaches, because it takes a lot more time. And business right now, this is not just a marketing thing. Business right now is assuming the mantra of cheaper and faster and plentiful. I mean, it's a Wall Street mandate. I mean, even today's startups know that they have to pivot their business in a matter of months if market conditions change or their business model changes or is in need of change. So, that trickles down to marketing in a couple of ways. I mean, most of the high profile CMOs, they're more interested in building their own personal brand. So they like to move fast. They like to break things and then like to move on. And then we're addicted to the instant feedback loop, and this is the agencies too, that results from today's marketing. I mean, how many likes did it get? How many opens did the email get? Did it go viral? Today's ad campaigns, they only run for a limited time and then they're gone.
Well, I think there's two errors in this article. I think they meant to say more effective versus more expensive. I think that's just a typo. I meant to say more effective advertising, expensive. And the sentiment behind a lot of this is that
I don't know if that's the
there's,
case. I would say that's probably not true.
I'm trying to mediate here. I'm trying to mediate here. So I think I meant to say effective, and I agree that the push to efficiency has been a burden. So the biggest issue is with this whole efficiency play, that's killed the P&L, and everything's got to be cheaper and better and more. And if it's more effective, then you can pull other levers in the same way as people focus on price, but they should focus on value. And if you want to create more valuable advertising, that pulls other different levers. I was just been to watch a load of the movies today. What's it, the Lion King, and they had great voice talent. The actors were computer generated, right? But you still had Beyonce, and you still had Childish Gambino, and you still had who's the British guy on HBO? I've forgotten his name. Comedian. Anyway, you still have those playing the voice actors, the talent. So you still need talent, which costs money, right? And so maybe you can't go back to the good old days of advertising, but I think if you're trying to push to be more effective, everyone signs up for that. If you go into your if you're a senior marketing, you just say I want more expensive advertising, the CFO is going to tell you to get something out of there. So that's not going to happen. But to create more effective and valuable advertising, I think there's been a dearth in the skills on the client and on the agency side. And I asked this question, and here is where I'm going to pivot the story. Especially we've had two people from all of you from the creative side. If I ask you how many briefs have you received that you would, what score out of 10 would you give the brief? 10 being awesome, 0 being, terrible. How many briefs have scored over a 7 in the last 5 years?
Very few. See,
that's the problem to fix. So if the clients deliver better briefs, then your product is going to be better. But if you get sucky input, then you're going to get sucky output. But I've asked that question for the last 10 years, and I always get the same answer. I get very few scores above a 5. Well, if the whole industry knows that's an issue and all clients know it's an issue, why aren't we fixing that as one of the solves to get better outcomes and better outputs? So that's not about being more expensive. It's just about being more effective, being better. And there's a huge capability gap on the client side, and there's a huge opportunity from both the client and the agency side to fix that. So that's one solution.
Let's let me be clear here. Let's be clear here. This is not what Rashad was saying. I mean, I agree with you in a large part that effectiveness is kind of like the watchword. But what he's saying is that we've been down this rat hole of effectiveness and DM to the extreme where we're constantly doing direct response as opposed to brand building. And, at the expense of brand building, what we end up doing is we end up pissing the consumer off by overloading them with lots of these quote unquote effective ads that are all about trying to drive a sale as opposed to doing the brand building and entertaining the consumer and giving them an experience that they feel is worthwhile. Now, I'm not
relevant that way.
Yeah, I'm not trying to make a case for his opinion. I'm just trying to be clear. That's what he's trying to say here. And, while I think that effectiveness is important, there is something to be said for we need to spend more money to make better, more beautiful ad experiences that drive the consumer to love us again, as opposed to hate us because
I think there's so much data that says you got to do brand building, and you got to do activation. You got to do both. So I think we're all sold. Certainly, any good marketer knows that you got to do both. If we've been sucked into the vortex of, quarterly sales or monthly sales, and I got to show that this delivers X in a short period of time, that's one piece of the strategy. The other strategy of brand building has to happen as a norm. And I think the Binnett and Field research over the past few years, and Mark Ritson's been talking about, there's lots of data say you've got to do both. And I don't think there's an argument to doing both. So his argument to saying we should stop doing just the short-term cheap stuff, yes. But you've got in the brand building, yes, I would agree with that. But that's not really an opinion. There's actually data and evidence to support why that has to be true.
I do think there's a white space opportunity here for those who do it, though. So whether or not everybody needs to go and do this, I don't know. I do think we've lost. It's exactly what you were talking about, Bob. We've lost that oh, that's cool. We've lost the famous part of advertising. We've lost the ability for people, or for brands in particular, to make an impact with people in a way that everybody talks about.
Okay,
And
let
when you
me
see a brand like,
let me caveat that real quick, because I think that's also another trope that we fall victim to, that somehow advertising isn't as good as it once was. And I think that advertising is just as good as it ever was. It has lots of great entertaining content. The trouble is there's so much bad content, and there's so much drive for response, that we're overwhelming the consumer. So
I think that's true.
Yeah.
And I also think there's always been, I mean, 20 years ago, there was more bad stuff than there was good stuff. That's always been true. It's also that we don't have as tidy a medium as network television to be able to put something where everybody can see it. But I was going to point out, a brand like Burger King, I think, is doing a lot of big swings. They're doing a lot of stuff, and I don't know. I kind of like that word, or that phrase, "big swings," better than expensive. Though I totally get what Rashad is saying. The idea is you're trying to do something big, and you're trying to get noticed, and you want to be able to do that rather than a bunch of little tactical stuff. And actually, I think sometimes it's if you do a lot of really good big stuff and you do really, really smart tactical stuff, those work really well together. I actually think we waste a lot of time doing medium-sized stuff, which is kind of it's not big enough to be interesting. It's not small enough to be tactical. It's just there, and there's a lot of that, and that's what people are seeing over and over and over again. And it does. We're numbed by it. We don't care. So you have to do something where we do care, and that's where I do think there's this opportunity. If people want to embrace it, if brand wants to do that the way the Burger King has been doing over the last few years, say we're going to do stuff that's interesting because it's going to help us stand out. It's going to help us be more noticeable. I think there are brands that could take advantage of that and see a lot of success from it.
Well, we're running low on time, so I want to move on to the last topic real quick. There are now 700,000 podcasts. This makes my heart hurt. I hurt every time I read this number. 700,000 podcasts, with 2,000 more joining the mix every week. But given the fact that most of these podcasts won't get past 10 episodes, I got to ask you guys, is the land rush helping or hurting the legitimacy of the medium as a brand engagement tactic? And is it helping or hurting the medium as a media worth advertising investment? Let's start with Dan. What's your thoughts there?
I think it's hurting. I think podcasts are becoming sort of the new blogs when everybody had one. I wrote for AdPulp for many years, and we tried to monetize it in a number of ways, and we just never put the pedal to the metal to get it done. So it's a really long tail. You've got a few winners and a lot of losers, and a lot of this pod fade, which is the new term I learned this week, which is when podcasts kind of just get launched and then they kind of go nowhere after a few episodes. I mean, you've been doing this a long time, Bob, and I know that the marketing podcast space is now crowded. It's ridiculously crowded. And I don't listen to other marketing podcasts besides the BeanCast, to be honest with you. This is still the best one as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
And but there's a lot of competition, and I think it's just crowding. Like I said, it's a long tail, and I think that it's not good for I don't know how brands, unless you can sort of roll it up and have like a deal where you can sponsor maybe 10,000 podcasts or 20,000 podcasts, just for a few cents a piece, how it makes sense for a brand. Otherwise, they're just going to go through the top ones and sponsor those.
I'm probably going to, it's a bit self-serving, but I'm a huge fan of podcasts, and I think the quality floats to the top, and this show obviously is one of the greatest ones. And the reason I started listening to this show back in the day, 10, 12, 11 years ago, is because there was no other product out there. There was nothing else that could talk to me as a marketer, and I could hear from people about things that mattered to me and I needed to learn about. And so I think there is still a need for meeting audiences and coming up with awesome content, and the bar is raising, and that's the challenge. I'll be honest here, I'm working on a podcast as well, and it may thrive and it may fail, but I'm still going to go for it. But I'm not going to be mediocre. And I think reading the article, it was kind of quite funny because apparently some people did 5 podcasts and didn't become rich and famous, and they quit. It's like, yeah, get out.
Yeah.
So if you've got to put the work in. It's not just rock up with a microphone and a computer and just talk. You've got to curate some content. You got to have a point of view. And again, this show is not just thrown together willy-nilly. There is some thought behind it. There's some thought from curating the topics and having the guests on there and the questions that are being asked. And you force us to think, you force us to debate. And that's why this lasts. So I think this story is inspiring, because if you want to be mediocre, then you're going to fail. You've got to be awesome. You've got to be remarkable, but not everyone is. And I think the pursuit of trying is you should still try, but you've got to put the work in, and you've got to I think have some passion behind it. And if you're a brand, like anything that a brand does, it's like, why should I care? What are you talking about? Why should I care? But there's a huge opportunity for stories, and some of the best storytelling comes from finding out who the founder of a company was, or how they created this flavor, or how this beer was brewed, or when as an immigrant they came to the country and they brought something and they founded this company. So, or the Steve Jobs. So I think the brands can tell stories. Can they just schlock their wares and create a podcast? Probably no. Sponsorship maybe, but find a relevant way. I think it's still possible.
Well, quality still matters, right, Sam?
Right.
I mean, I agree completely. And there's an interesting thing here too, where I believe brands, not other brands that are doing a podcast, but I mean the brand, like the BeanCast as a brand. Bob, you as a brand that you do this podcast, that matters. And the fact that you've been doing this for a long time, that you have the level of quality and the fine stable of guests that you have on the show, that matters. And I would say that the Land Rush is helping simply because it helps continue to legitimize what a powerful platform this is. And I did a quick Google search a second ago. If it helps, on Spotify, there are 24,000 songs added every single day. So that dwarfs the 2,000 podcasts every week stat. Not all of them are going to be good. The ones that are good, the ones that build those brands and build those audiences, they're going to succeed. And I love that podcasting as a medium has become such a force. It's amazing. And the passion that people have for the different podcast brands out there, that's exciting.
Well, one thing I would say about this, and this goes back to what you were saying, Sam. Commitment matters more than anything. I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, it matters whether or not you have a good sounding audio product. It matters, but it doesn't kill your chances of success. But if you commit to your audience the same way that your audience commits to you, then you have the chance to have real success. Other than that, all you're doing is creating audio content, and that's not a podcast. That's not the kind of thing that you subscribe to. That's the thing you go to a website and you listen to the episodes because you're interested in hearing about, what's happening in craft foods today. What happened at craft foods 100 years ago. It's a whole different way of engaging with content. Whereas podcasts, it's more about commitment. I've always said that's most important. That's the first thing I say to every client who wants me to develop a podcast for them. It really comes down to, are you willing to commit to it? Because if you're not willing to commit to it, it's not worth your time.
Yeah, and I fully agree with that. And to build on that would be the key part to this is it's an egalitarian opportunity. It allows diverse voices and different voices to have access to their audiences, and that's what I love about this space. So a lot of the shows and the topics and the content is meeting a need for audiences who otherwise wouldn't have a voice, or couldn't get their voice heard, or couldn't connect with their people. And so for me, I'm excited because you don't have to be a big media company to have access to this. It's like social media, which in a lot of the social platforms have more diverse audiences and users, because it's given access and giving a voice to people who would normally be precluded or excluded from opportunities like that. So I think the talent, the creativity, but also the audience needs are being served, and that's what excites me, and that's why I want to be part of the game. But as you say, Bob, you got to be committed. Don't be lame. and stop whinging about not making money out of it, because if that's what you're in it for, then you're probably not in it for the right
Well,
reasons.
one thing I'm glad about is all these things consistently prove out that the Forrester social technographics ladder still is true. Only 20% of us are ever going to be creators, and only 10% of us are going to stick to it and become top creators. So that's just it. Everybody else is just playing around with the tools for once in a while and not really consistently putting content up. If you don't know what the social technographics ladder is, look it up. I don't have time to explain it to you. Well, it's time for the good, the bad,
Ooh,
and the
snooty.
ugly. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Dan Goldgeier. You can find more about Dan and his books and his dogs at dangoldgeier.com. Tell us what's going on in your world, Dan. What would you like to promote?
Yeah, I've been working with some fun clients. I'm always looking for more. So if you need some great copywriting and strategy, you can find me at dangoldgeier.com. You can also go onto Amazon and buy one of my books. The one I'd recommend is Killer Executions and Scrub Decks, an outside the box look at obnoxious advertising and marketing jargon, all the terms you love to hate. And all proceeds go to feed my dog.
Yeah, I love your dogs.
Yeah, I love them too. They're waiting for a walk right now.
Next up, we have Tim Leake. You can find him at rpa.com, which I still think is one of the best addresses out there, next to, RGA, which also has a 3-year letter. See what I did there? See what I did there? We had to talk about this before the show. Tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote?
I thought long and hard about what to shamelessly promote, and I really don't. Someday I'll have a great book, and I'm going to do that. So, for today, I was just going to push it back, which now you're going to feel bad about the RGA joke, but and say, you know what, in building off of what we just talked about with the podcast, to say as a shameless plug, thank you, Bob, for doing this podcast. For the work that you do for our industry and committing to that. And so if anybody out there is looking for a great consultant to work with on the marketing, you should talk to Bob or Dan at dangoldgeier.com. And also go to Content Marketing World and use the code BeanCast in all caps.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, when I finished that ad, I was just kind of thinking, man, I forgot all the people. Kate O'Neill is going to be there. It's just like Ann Hanley. All the names came back to me after I was done the ad. So, yeah, a lot of people will be there, worth seeing. Last but not least, Sam Monnie. You can find him for a little while at least at Campbell Soup, but he's going to be moving on. So we're going to be promoting his LinkedIn address. We always do the LinkedIn address on the name in the show notes, so you can go find him and get in touch and find out what's new and next for him. But tell us what's going on in your world, Sam. What would you like to promote?
Well, Bob, funnily enough, guess who's working on a podcast that's coming probably in fall 2019? Yes, that's right. No other than myself and a buddy of mine. And we have a name, we have the content, we're crafting as we speak and putting hours of blood, sweat, and tears into this thing. And we're not winging it, and we're not going to be lame. Well, that's the hope anyway. So coming soon. More to come in the near future, but that's close to being able to ship that. And also, Bob, I am going to commit 2020. I will publish my book. I will have it written and done. So that's something I'm working underway right now. Another passion project of mine. So the podcast is coming, and the book 2020. Wait for it. So you'll have to have me back on, Bob, to talk more about myself. And
I love having you. I love having you on the program, Sam. And it's just like. As for my marketing book, I think I've put that on the back shelf. I'm just writing plays now. I'm enjoying that a lot more. As for
I'm
me,
looking forward to the play.
Well, I've got some if you want to read them. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. Thank you very much, Tim. And you can even find out how to advertise on the program. Again, thank you very much, Tim. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for the good, the bad, and the ugly, a rundown of the best and worst of advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. First up, the good for this week. I love the China Airlines video that they put out this past week. Taiwan-based carrier China Airlines is breaking the internet with their latest ad by agency Leo Burnett Taiwan. Because instead of showing all the amazing places you can go, Sam, like most travel ads would do, they're instead featuring all the unexpected things you may bring back, and not all of those are positives. I think this ad is hysterical, and it's really well thought out because it actually makes you want to travel.
Which airline was that again, Bob? They needed to make the logo bigger. That was the big issue. No, but actually, no, that's it. Legit. I watched it. And I thought, oh yeah, I forgot which airline. But anyway, actually, I thought it was quite human, and it was very well acted, and it was essentially The Hangover as an ad. So kudos to them for taking the veneer off travel and keeping it real, and actually having an airline ad which wasn't the usual smiley faces and beautiful air shots and people with uniforms on and people with gorgeous food on their plates. So well done to them for keeping it real and making us watch the ad from beginning to end and share it.
The power of a great creative idea.
Yep.
Look at that.
Yep.
Expensive as well, I'm sure.
Yes, it was.
Full circle. Nice.
Yes.
Speaking of circles, Circle K Mexico ran a promotion for chocolate, wine, and condoms for, wait for it, for Secretary's Day. I'm just thinking in the Me Too era, Dan, I'm just thinking this is just about one of the worst ads or one of the worst promotions I've seen put together in a long, long time. To actually think that it would be okay to put together a package of chocolate, wine, and condoms for Secretary's Day is ludicrous.
Yeah, and who goes to Circle K to get wine anyway? I wouldn't do that. But it's a pretty bad idea. And they were rightfully called out for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, moving on to the ugly of the week. This one is just, for me, it's kind of like you should have really expected something like this. But first, Sam, since you're on the show, we'll call it Adidas, Adidas, and
Thank you, Bob.
Arizona Tea did a 99-cent sneaker deal in a New York pop-up store. What they did was they did a mashup. They put the Arizona iced tea logo and all kinds of graphics on a sneaker made by Adidas. They were supposed to have a limited supply, but you can get them for 99 cents if you just lined up outside this pop-up store. And chaos soon ensued. People were punched in the face and beaten to the ground, and everybody's fighting to get in line. The cops were called. The whole thing was shut down before even a single sneaker was moved off the shelves. Tim, this is one of those things where, the brand had a really good idea. They may have not thought about the security issue enough, but both these brands had a really great idea, and they just got caught in the middle of a really big, awful, bad, ugly storm.
Yeah, I gotta say, I love it. I love how ugly these shoes are, and yet they're desirable. I love the weird. It's just like this blatant cross promotion, which is fantastic. The fact that they got shut down. I don't know the hopefully nobody was hurt or arrested as part of this, but the press that they got because of it, I'm going to guess that I wouldn't have necessarily heard about this story if that hadn't happened. So maybe not entirely unfortunate as far as it goes for them. Anytime, the sneaker culture stuff, it just continues to blow my mind how passionate people are, as well as people's desire to stand in really, really long lines to save small amounts of money that if they just worked for that amount of time, they would have made more money than they saved by standing in that line. Maybe that's not true with these shoes, but
you might be missing the whole
wasting a lot of time.
Well, you might be missing the whole sneaker culture thing there entirely. But
people will stand in long lines and pay a lot of money for it.
Then there was the story in Agency Spy this week that Miles Nadal, who was the CEO of MDC, he bought a bunch of rare sneakers for $850,000. Wow. So people will do insane stuff for sneakers. Makes people nuts.
True. So the idea that they were going to be really, really crowded had probably occurred to them.
Yeah, it probably did. It probably did. Well, have a suggestion for this list or just want to discuss it? Comment online. Use the hashtag GBU. That's #GBU. Well, that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, and there are so many of them, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Let's try that again. beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
You know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. Just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.